Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to GTR US. This is the leading event for the US trade and supply chain and working capital financing community. So excited to have you here. My name is Angelica Malin. I'm a global MC and moderator, and this is my second year returning as the chair. Show of hands, who was here last year for this event? Okay, quite a few of you. And hands up, who's never been to a GTR event before, first time? Welcome. Okay, great. Well, it's great to have everyone here. I've got a few little housekeeping notes. You will see QR codes in front of you. If you scan those QR codes, you can find the event app. You're going to find the agenda and all the speakers and the delegate list for today. Really important. So if you can scan that, and you can also use the app to ask questions. So there's going to be an opportunity throughout the sessions, at the end of the sessions, to ask questions to our panelists and our speakers. So if you'd like to do that, please do use the event app for that. And also, there is an evaluation form, and at the end of today, someone will win an Apple Watch. So please stay around and do the evaluation form, and you can win an Apple Watch. And then final little note from me is please keep your belongings with you, because we're going to have that throughout the day. So please keep your belongings with you and take them with you for the various breaks. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Neil Shearing, who's the Group Chief Economist at Capital Economics. He's going to provide a keynote address, The Fractured Age, the Threats and Opportunities Confronting the World Economy. So please welcome Neil to the stage.
Thanks very much. It's a longer walk than I thought that, sorry. I'm delighted to be here today. I haven't been to this GTR event, but I did participate in the one in Singapore earlier this year, and it was a fantastic event, so I'm delighted to be back in the US. As you just heard, I'm going to talk to you about what I've called the fractured age. This is based on the book that I've just published, The Fractured Age, How the Return of Geopolitics is Going to Splinter the Global Economy. And I'm going to talk you through the key themes and messages in that book, because it has key implications for global trade and touches on markets and affects everyone in this room. I'll talk to you a bit about what I mean by fracturing, what is fracturing. I'll talk to you a bit about how the return of President Trump to the White House might affect this fractured world. And I'll talk a bit about what it means for the global economy and for global trade flows, because I think some of the conclusions are a bit more nuanced than you might otherwise think if you just open the pages of the journal and the FT. I'll take you back to the genesis of the book, all the way back to President Trump's first term in office in 2017 and 2018. Back then, tariffs were going up. There's lots of concern in the media about the world turning inwards, a return to the 1930s. The world was deglobalizing. And we could see this rhetoric everywhere, in the Financial Times, in Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal, but we couldn't see it in the data, as you can see in this chart. This chart's showing you global trade flows as a share of world GDP, global trade volumes as a share of world GDP. I've marked on Trump's first election victory there with the arrow. You can see, if anything, trade flows have actually increased since that time. So lots of rhetoric around deglobalization, but not much evidence of it actually happening in practice. So at Capital Economics, which is where I'm the chief economist, we sat back down and asked ourselves, well, what's changing? Because it was pretty clear that something was changing. And the more we looked at it, the more we came to the conclusion that the world was not deglobalizing. Rather, the defining feature of the global economy over the past decade has been an intensification of a superpower rivalry between the US on the one hand and China on the other. And this was causing the US and China to pull apart. And this was a feature of not just Trump's first term in office, but also Biden's, under the Biden administration. And actually in the book, I trace the origins of this fracturing, not to anything that happened here in the US, but actually to President Xi becoming leader of China in 2012. So the US and China are pulling apart. this is causing those economies to fracture, if you like, and other countries are being forced increasingly to pick a side in this fracturing. And the economic consequences of that fracturing, as I say in the book, will depend upon the fault lines of fracturing. Does it affect all trade and capital flows between these blocks, or just a few handful of sensitive geopolitically sensitive areas? And how do other countries align in this fractured world? Normally at this point, there's a bit of pushback, and someone says, well, what's the evidence for this fracturing actually happening in practice? I think this gives you a good sense of how this is playing out in the real world. It's showing you where the US gets its cell phone imports from. China's the red line, and you can see if you look back to 2020, nearly 2/3 of cell phone imports to the US came from China. Virtually no cell phones were imported from the US. From India. Fast forward to today, and India is on course to become the world's biggest supplier of mobile phone imports to the US, and China is accounting for barely 1 in 5. So this is a real-life example, an illustration of how this fracturing is affecting and shaping global supply chains. Here's the central scenario that I sketch out in the book. The US and China remain the world's preeminent global superpowers. As they pull apart, other countries are forced essentially to pick a side. That this fracturing and this pulling apart will be really confined to 3 key areas. Anything that compromises supply chain security, anything that compromises national security, and anything that compromises technological leadership. So think about chips, biotech, dual-use goods, those goods that have applications in civilian and military life. Those are the fault lines of this fracturing. And this fracturing does not, therefore, represent deglobalization. There's plenty of trade that's happening between these two blocks that's unaffected. But the key question we've got to ask ourselves is, how do other countries align, and actually will that fracturing be contained to those strategically important areas? If you wind the clock back to the start of the year, this is how at Capital Economics we saw the world aligning into these, coalescing into these blocks. So this is based on our analysis of global trade flows, capital flows, memberships of defence and security alliances, geopolitical voting patterns in things like the UN General Assembly. We put all of that into a model, and then that enables us to sort whether countries are really strong US allies, whether they lean towards the US, that's in the blue, whether they're neutral, it's in the grey, and then if you lean towards China, it's light red, and if you're a very strong China ally, you're dark red. And all this data, by the way, is available on the Capital Economics platform. So this is how we saw the world in the start of this year. A key point to emphasize here is the US is starting from a position of strength. You split the world by population, about half of the world's population is in those red countries, and a half of that is in the blue countries. However, if you split the world by GDP, about 2/3 is in the blue countries, and about 25% is in the red countries, with the remainder in the grey. And what's more, if you look at the economic diversity within that US bloc, it's much greater. You've got advanced technology producers like Korea, Taiwan, Japan. You've got traditional manufacturers like Germany, knowledge economies like the UK, low-cost manufacturers like Mexico, India, Vietnam, the Philippines. You've got natural resource producers like Canada and Australia. And then in the China bloc, you really just have China dominates that bloc, and then a few commodity producers pegged on the end, attached on the end. So that gives the US much greater heft. The US bloc has much greater heft in the global economy, and within that bloc, there's much greater ability to adapt and to flex to the challenges, in the face of the challenges posed by this fracturing. And you saw a good example of that with the way that supply chains around mobile phones have shifted. And into all of that kind of position of strength, we throw the return of President Trump, and his threats to annex Greenland and make Canada the 51st state, and generally to rile America's traditional allies with what seems to be an arbitrary tariff policy. So I'll talk a little bit about what are the lessons from the first, well, now 10 months of Trump's second term, and scenarios for how this might play out, what the economic implications might be. Now, if you were to just open the pages of the financial press, you would be forgiven for thinking that the US administration's tariff policy has been entirely arbitrary. It's hit allies and adversaries alike. And actually, that's not the case. So if we look at the average tariff rate that the US is now charging, levying on countries by block, by those red blocks and blue blocks that I showed you earlier, you can see here that there's evidence of this fracturing playing out even in the tariff policy. It might seem arbitrary, but the America's allies have been on the receiving end of much lower tariffs than is the case with China's allies. You can see that here. Red block, the red bar much higher than the blue bar. This is showing the effective tariff rates by block. What's more, this is not just about trade. I know trade is obviously what we're concerned with most about in this room, but fracturing extends beyond trade. If you look at global capital flows, the America First investment memorandum at the start of this year explicitly stated an aim to attract investment from America's allies and deter it, push it away from America's adversaries, and it name-checked China as one of those adversaries. China, for its part, has frozen approvals on FDI into the US, and although America's geopolitical relations with its traditional allies are clearly under strain, NATO has not broken down fully, despite fears that it might. And America has maintained and indeed even stepped up its presence in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think the idea that we've seen a return to kind of US isolationism in this second Trump administration, I think doesn't quite meet the evidence. However, it would be naive to think that it doesn't matter at all and that the forces that are shaping fracturing have been unchanged as a result of the events of the past 10 months or so. So when we think about how this geopolitical map might shift and change under Trump, I think there are a few scenarios that we might consider. You might end up with the US and China reaching some kind of rapprochement, a détente. You could end up with more fracturing. So maybe a third bloc emerges in this fractured world. And I think you might get some movement between blocks too. Maybe some countries move out of that US bloc and into the China bloc. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those things in turn. On the issue of whether there might be a détente between the US and China, a rapprochement brokered by Trump and Xi, I have to say I'm pretty sceptical. If you look at the deal that was agreed between the two leaders in late October, I think it's clearly rolled back some of the tariffs. That's a good thing. We've stepped back from the brink. It marks a de-escalation in tensions, but it doesn't really address the fundamental issues that are causing this superpower rivalry to intensify. Moreover, the direct economic impact for China, the benefit for China is pretty small, about 0.1% of its GDP. There's not really much effect there. The US tariff rate on China is still much higher now than was the case at the start of this year. And as I say, these fundamental issues and strains in the relationship have not gone away. Indeed, if you look at what the Phase 1 trade deal did during the first Trump administration, I think it speaks to some of the kind of mistrust that is now emerging on both sides. This chart shows you China's goods imports from the US in blue against the little green bars there are what it committed to purchase during the first the Phase 1 trade deal in the first administration. So you see, it got nowhere close to fulfilling its commitments as part of that deal. And that, in turn, is fueling this kind of mistrust on both sides. Both sides, countries, I think, feel threatened by one another. Neither side, as a result, can credibly commit to not to re-escalate in future. And so that, therefore, creates an incentive to keep ties, economic ties, to a minimum. I think the best way of thinking about the deal that's been done is that it buys some time to allow both countries to decouple in areas that they believe they need to for security reasons. So some pretty major roadblocks to a US-China détente. What about that second scenario that I talked about? That you might get some more greater fracturing, maybe a third bloc emerges around which other countries could coalesce in this fractured world. Well, it's certainly the case that when we look at the US bloc, US allies, traditional allies, are feeling a bit maligned by the US. So this is showing you how countries tend to vote with the US in the UN General Assembly. So the blue line is US allies voting with the US in the UN General Assembly, and the red line is China allies voting with the US in the UN General Assembly. You can see that it's normally the case that on about 2/3 of occasions, US allies tend to vote with the US in the UN General Assembly. That's collapsed in recent months. So there's definitely seems to be a shift underway within the US bloc, and that's precipitated this idea that we might end up with some greater fragmentation. However, I'm pretty sceptical that's going to happen too. The idea that we might get a third bloc emerging in this fractured world doesn't really sit comfortably alongside the blunt truth that there's no one else that's really that can really challenge the US or China in terms of economic heft. So this chart shows you countries by GDP, with the US set to 100. China is about 60% of US GDP at market exchange rates. The next largest country is Germany, about 15%, Japan 10%. The last time we had a truly multipolar world was probably the late 19th century. Then you had the UK, the US, France, and Prussia. At that point, the UK was the world's largest economy. Prussia was the fourth largest economy. It was about 70% of UK GDP at that point. So much more even distribution in terms of GDP. I simply don't think there's a bloc that's capable of challenging either the US or China. Some say Europe could if it got together, but the problem there is, of course, they're a group of sovereign states that struggle to speak with one voice. I think the same is true if you look at leads in critical and emerging technologies. The US and China, by far and away, the world's biggest leaders in critical and emerging technologies. So I'm pretty sceptical that there's any prospect of Europe in particular emerging as this third bloc that might challenge the US and China. You can see here, doesn't have the technological heft, doesn't have the economic heft. Even if it could get together, it struggles to speak with one voice. What about the idea that countries might break apart from the US bloc and there might be some shifting between blocs? You might not get a third bloc emerging, but you might get countries moving from one bloc to another. I think that stands that's possibly a greater likelihood of that happening. This chart here shows you the current effective tariff rate. It's really striking that those two countries on the far left-hand side, India and Brazil, are now facing a higher tariff rate than China. So I think if there's a change in the geopolitical map, it's not going to be that we get a third bloc. It's not going to be that we get a repair in the relationship between the US and China. It's that some countries that had been leaning towards the US now start to either become more unaligned or start to lean back towards even China. And I think that would be the key risk for the US in all of this. With that being said, the idea that India in particular is going to become this really strong US ally, I think we just need to check that a little. You can see here, China now runs a large trade surplus with most emerging economies. Its trade surplus is larger with EMs than it is with DMs. And in the case of India, they're deeply concerned about Chinese technology in the Indian ecosystem. They're deeply concerned about the Chinese economic competition in the manufacturing. They have a long-running border dispute with China, and there's increasing concerns about water security as a result of the Chinese building big dams along the Indian border. So possible that India shifts from the US bloc a bit closer to China, but I don't think it's going to become a really strong China ally. Something to keep an eye on, though. So where does all of that leave us? Well, clearly the kind of more mercurial nature, if you like, of this administration has increased the range of possible outcomes in this fractured world. However, with all that being said, I still believe that the US-China fissure is going to remain the central dividing point, if you like, within the global economy over the next decade or so. The key uncertainties in this fractured world remain, one, where are the fault lines of this fracturing going to be drawn? Is it going to be contained to those geostrategically important areas that I mentioned at the start, or does it become wider? And the second is, how do other countries align? That gets us to thinking about the economic consequences. We need to think about how deep the split's going to be, how wide the split might be, how other countries align, and in particular, will the US relinquish its strong starting point? I still think a contained form of fracturing remains a reasonable base case. I still don't see much evidence that there's a hard split across all areas between these blocks. I still think, if you think about the events of the past year or so, it's contained to those geostrategically important areas. If you think about trade between these blocks, it's only about 15% of global trade. 85% takes place either within the China bloc or within the US bloc. The US itself is only responsible for just under 10% of global imports. So if it's tariffs you're worried about, I don't think we're going to get a big collapse in global trade. This is the chart of global GDP split by these blocks. And it emphasizes, I put this up here to emphasize the America's strong starting position. So you can see here, you've got about 2/3 of global GDP in those blue blocks. So my big concern here is that if you're the US, you start to push your allies away and you relinquish some of that strong starting point. You lose your economic heft in the global economy, but also you lose some of the economic diversity that is helping you to adapt and to flex to the challenges posed by fracturing. If you look at the China bloc, China obviously dominates to a much greater extent in terms of GDP, but in terms of the other countries, they're mainly commodity producers. Now that has important implications when we consider where the production of key commodities take place within geopolitical blocs. Rare earths have clearly been in the news over the past couple of months or so. This is showing you the production of commodities by bloc in terms of total global production. Rare earths is there second from top. Cobalt comes overwhelmingly from the China bloc. So does zinc, so does some old commodities like coal too. So China has this stranglehold over key areas of critical minerals and natural resources by virtue of its geopolitical relationships. What it doesn't have, if you think about this chart, is much in the way of technological prowess within its bloc. It's having to do a lot of the heavy lifting on the technological front on its own. And in many cases, it's succeeding. If you think about BYD in electric vehicles, global leader. CATL in batteries, global leader. Huawei in telecoms, pushing the global technological frontier. However, that's coming at a cost. It's being driven by industrial subsidy. About 5% of GDP is being funneled into the Chinese manufacturing sector in terms of subsidies each year, and it's coming at a cost. It's enabling these companies to compete at the global technological frontier, but it's creating a long tail of loss-making companies in China that are being sustained by subsidies. You can see here that about 1 in 3 of China's industrial firms are now making a loss, sustained by these industrial subsidies. So you end up with a slightly paradoxical Chinese economy as a result of this fracturing, having to do a lot of the heavy lifting and technology on its own and succeeding thanks to massive government subsidies, but also those subsidies propping up a long tail of increasingly loss-making firms. What are the economic consequences of all of this? Well, if we end up with a relatively contained form of fracturing, then I think there will be some efficiency losses within the global economy, but they'll be relatively small, about 1% of global GDP. And if the US bloc holds together, if the US keeps its allies on side, then I think most of those costs will fall primarily on the China side, because China's having to do this heavy lifting on the technological front itself. If the US pushes its allies away, the US bloc itself starts to fragment, then we'll end up with more of the cost being shifted towards the US and less on China. And if we think about more adverse scenarios, if you get a much bigger break between these two blocks, then maybe the costs aren't 1% of GDP. They're maybe even 3, 4, 5% of GDP. That's more like a global financial crisis type of loss. In the case of America pushes its allies away, more of the costs fall on the US, then American growth, I think, could slow to 1% a year. That's a number I put in the book. And if you're feeling particularly sunny on this nice, bright December morning, Chapter 8 goes into the economic consequences of conflict between the blocks. And there, I think the hit to global GDP and trade flows is the least of our concerns, but they would be enormous, potentially as much as 10% of GDP. So, key messages. The US and China, I think, remains the global, the main fissure within the global economy over the coming decade. I don't think we'll get massive deglobalization. I think we'll get some efficiency losses. A lot of trade and capital flows will remain unaffected. The cost, though, of this relatively contained form of fracturing will be unevenly distributed. And a lot will depend upon whether the US can keep its allies on side. If the US does keep its allies on side, costs are about 1% of global GDP. They fall mainly on China. If the US pushes its allies away, then more of the costs fall on America's side. And if we end up with a bigger split between these blocks, then the economic costs ratchet higher and higher, maybe 4 to 5% of GDP, and that looks more like a global financial crisis in terms of losses. And there, the key messages from the book, which you can see here. And I'm very happy to take any questions, and there's 5 minutes left. I think I've got a bit back on time. There's a question there, yeah.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Alyssa. I have a question on depopulation, of global depopulation, not in the US specifically, but China, South America, Europe, the UK, etc. US probably come into that soon. How does that affect the economics in the next 20, 30, 40 years? Thank you.
Yeah, so big shifts in and big differences between global demographic patterns across the world. Actually, you mentioned China, East Asia, China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan. That's where the demographics get particularly bad. And they get particularly bad, not necessarily in the next 20 years. They start to kind of tail off. It's really the second half of this decade. Particularly China's population falls off a cliff over the second half of this decade as the effects of the one-child policy really start to bite. That will knock about 1% a year off of economic growth in China. So that's significant. But bear in mind that China's economy used to grow at 10% a year. On our Capital Economics' own in-house measure of economic growth, China Activity Proxy, it's now grown at about 3% a year. So you've already had quite a big slowdown from 10% to 3%. That's not really about demographics, that's about productivity growth. And it comes back to this question of strains in the growth model, excess investment, subsidies, et cetera, pulling down productivity growth. So demographics matter. They matter over a long period of time, though. I think the relative growth performance over the next decade is going to be driven far more by productivity shifts. The US, the key question is, can this nascent improvement in productivity we've seen as a result, I think, of AI continue over the next decade? I'm pretty bullish that it can, but it's uncertain, I think it's fair to say. In China, will the authorities embrace reform, shift away from a high savings, high investment growth model, embrace reform, start to tackle this legacy of overcapacity? If they do, then you can get growth back up from 3% to closer to 4 or 5. If they don't, then growth's going to slow further and further and further, maybe as low as 2% a year. Any other question? Right, yeah. Do I think there's a bubble in the AI sector? If so, and if it pops, how might it affect the US-China dynamic? So I think it's really important to distinguish between the macro and the markets in all of this. Is there a bubble around AI investment in the real economy? Possibly. But typically that's how investment these new technologies tend to be diffused within and across economies. We've done a lot of work at Capital Economics looking at this. We think that AI is a genuinely transformatory technology, a general purpose technology. It will raise productivity, but you typically need a period of overinvestment to bring down the cost, spread the technology, and get it widely adopted. So I suspect there probably is a bit of overinvestment in the real economy. Critical question here is there excess enthusiasm in financial markets? And I suspect the answer there is yes, too. When does it pop? Well, you can look at the dot-com period and bubble as a potential barometer. The difference this time around is there's been genuine earnings growth within some of the hyperscalers. But valuations, if you look at earnings multiples, are not quite where we got to in the late 90s. So my sense is that there's a bit of life left in this bubble, and it's probably not a story for 2026. It's more the popping of the bubble comes 2027, 2028, something like that. But I think once that bubble pops, then you're still left with the underlying technology, and it will, as I say, I think transform productivity potential. Really interesting dynamic between the US and China. China is now rivaling the US in terms of the ability of its large language models. It's perhaps about 6 months behind the US in that regard. Where it really lags the US, though, is in the foundational technologies, the semiconductors that are needed to build out data warehousing and et cetera, et cetera. That's the key weakness in China. Sir.
Hi, Kevin Brightman, UBA. Quick question. So while we were focusing primarily on North America, China, and relationship into tariffs, do you see any increase or significant increase in trade activity towards African continent and African countries, especially as potential path through from China, to different countries, in order to avoid tariffs or to significantly increase the trade into the African continent?
Yeah, good question. On the first question about, or the first potential in terms of trade diversion or rerouting, Africa is not the obvious place where you would reroute goods if you're a Chinese producer. It would tend to come through Vietnam, it's historically come through Vietnam and Mexico. I think the interesting dynamic now is that both of those countries are pushing back on the idea of being turned into a really kind of third-party staging post for Chinese production and being shipped into the US tariff-free. So I suspect we'll see rather less rerouting going on to get around tariffs this time around than was the case in the first trade war. So that leaves us with the idea that Africa becomes, you see an increase in global trade involving Africa because of Africa's growth prospects. And I think, frankly, they are relatively good compared to developed markets, but they're relatively poor compared to other emerging economies, particularly in Southeast Asia. So when we rank economies by kind of growth potential in terms of trade, Africa sits somewhere in the growth side in the middle. Southeast Asia is where a lot of the growth in trade comes. North America is where a lot of the consumption happens. East Asia is where a lot of the production happens, and they're going to be the three main areas of global trade. And then within Europe, it's mainly kind of within the European bloc rather than, and with the US rather than with Africa. I'm out of time, so I'm going to hand you back. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is the strategic panel to open the day, where we talk about making supply chains great again. It's an overused term, but I think we can all agree it's very topical. We will discuss how corporates are dealing with all the uncertainty and change in the environment, and how we, as trade banks, are helping them deal with it in order to make their supply chains not just great again, but more robust and more competitive to deal with all the issues you just heard about in the opening keynote. I'm John Richmond. I'm responsible for trade and working capital sales for Santander in the US. I am also a very proud and veteran moderator of GTR panels. It's always a pleasure to be here. I enjoy it very much, and I am delighted to have a distinguished panel. I am going to let them introduce themselves, start with Sophia from my left to right.
Okay, good morning. I'm Sophia Hamusha. I'm the Global Head of Trade and Working Capital for Standard Chartered Bank, based in Singapore. long way from here. Different weather also. Nice meeting you.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Hanai Orozco, and I have the honor of being the Global Supply Chain Manager for an organization named T.D. Williamson. We are in the energy space. We are a pipeline optimization and pipeline integrity company providing services in 35 different countries.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stuart Roberts. I'm a partner at Procura Inventory Management Company. We are, as we say, an inventory management company working with banks like yourselves to help our corporate customers manage their inventory more efficiently.
Thank you very much. And Mansour Devarin, I head up Transaction Banking Solutions, which is the sales, structuring, and execution of all our transaction banking products across cash and trade at Lloyds Bank.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. So we're going to make this conversational. I would encourage folks to ask some questions. We'll leave at least 10 minutes or so towards the end. So I'm sure there'll be lots of good ones. Make them as hard as you can. So I would like to start with the corporate perspective, since the client is always at the center of everything we do in banking. Hanai, post-Liberation Day, how much progress would you say has been made by corporates in diversifying and making their supply chains more resilient? And would you say that this is a continuing theme over the last few years, or is it something much more dramatic that maybe started earlier this year?
It's an interesting question indeed. And the reality is, when you look at the landscape, not just of our organization, but any organization in supply chain, irrespective of you're the energy sector, you're food and beverage, or pharmaceutical or medicine, the reality is, even a couple years back, it wasn't very long ago where we were beaten by a triple black swan effect of COVID. And what happened there. That was the first reality check into business. And since then, it's been a dynamic environment when it comes to what organizations are actually doing. The silver lining for an organization like ourselves and most organizations is the reality that now more than ever, they're really focused on their core activity. And everything that indirectly impacts an organization, they're really looking at strategic partners in the ecosystem to help satisfy that. Now, with that comes a lot of additional support needed from vendors and suppliers, for that matter. But when you look at the core business of an organization, if they're in the manufacturing space, they're really, really drilling down on where these products are actually being made. You hear a lot of different buzzwords like optimization, of nearshoring, offshoring. All of these, they actually matter. These are real things. And organizations are really looking at where is it more economical to protect EBITDA, to protect the financial aspect of the business on that particular front.
So something that's going to continue to accelerate over time.
It's not slowing down. And supply chains all over the industry are actually ripe for this. More supply chain professionals now more than ever along the entire chain of an organization, whether you're in finance, whether you're in IT, or you're actually in sourcing or supplier management. They're now trained more than ever to actually deal with this type of disruption. But it's actually up to the organizations to build this into their DNA, because that's where it actually begins. So people can come and go, but the core values of organization and the practice of supply chain and having strategic partners along the chain is something that's not going away. It's going to be strengthened.
Okay, good. Let's move over to the...
Actually, John, can I just add something to that? Because I think it's very, very important, is, you know, this trend predates both tariff risk. It predates even COVID. So if you look at today, there's about 3.25 trillion of inventory just within the US. And that has been steadily growing year in, year out. I think the biggest driver of that has been a change in customer behavior and e-commerce, right? So I live in Manhattan. My wife is always getting boxes delivered to our apartment. She can order something in the morning and it arrives in the afternoon, which means a supply chain that historically would say, hey, you can wait a week, is now saying, no, you can't. So it causes a huge amount of readjustment in those supply chains. It causes a huge amount of adjustments in vendor-managed inventory, buffer stocking, localization of stock that, you know, has an undercurrent that has got nothing to do with tariffs, and has got everything to do with customer behavior and the way companies run their operations.
So clearly a dramatically changing world from the corporate perspective. So let's move over to the bank side with Sophia. What best practices have you seen that corporates have undertaken in the trade and working capital space in order to manage all of these macro issues, supply chain disruptions, and just changes in client behavior?
I think it was quite clear that it's not new. So a lot of strategies started before. Now it's more about acceleration and really raising it to the top of the house, because it became really a matter of resilience and survival. Like, it's not just we are managing the tariff and it's very specific to this time. Every year we do a report called Future of Trade, and we survey a lot of corporates. The clients are at the center of everything, so we ask them directly, what are you doing? So what emerged this time is really 3 angles that are very specific to how do we manage what's going on in the supply chain disruptions and the geopolitical topics and what's happening in the equity market and many things that happen at the same time. So first of all, from a geographical perspective, that remains really core to what's happening. So how do I make sure that we diversify geographically our supply chain in a sustainable manner? So beyond just doing, we heard a lot about China plus one, China plus many, that evolved into more blocks-oriented kind of supply chain management. So really not necessarily nearshoring, but being more aligned to a certain block. We've seen different countries emerge as new geographical powerhouses in supply chain finance. I think in the keynote speech earlier, we discussed ASEAN, and that was alluded to. That's clearly something that picking up much stronger. So countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are really picking up speed and importance into the supply chain diversification, geographically speaking, but India as well. One other block that is emerging is the Middle East. I think there was a question around Africa, but what we don't talk about is really the Middle East and how it's really raising in terms of importance in supply chain. So really geographical diversification, but more from a long-term perspective this time, and more resilience and sustainability in terms of closer blocks that will rely on within the block itself. The second thing, and specifically to the emerging markets, which are core to the supply chain finance, topics like securing liquidity and forex currency exposure is core now, because the disruption was quite brutal this time, and it's going to continue. So really integrating the working capital and looking at it end-to-end, including securing liquidity and foreign currency protection, was really core now into the conversation with the different corporates. And lastly, I think the acceleration is also in terms of digitalization. We've talked a lot about onboarding and adopting digital platforms within supply chain finance world. Within the corporates that we have surveyed, 40% roughly have already adopted supply chain finance platform throughout different, either on the receivable side, the inventory side, or the supplier finance side. What was emerging from that survey is that 57% now are looking at adopting new supply chain finance platform in the next 2 years. And that's really important in the shift we will see from the bank perspective, and how do we work with the corporates and the platform going forward. So really now a multi-pronged approach to tackling this disruption in the future.
Okay, that's interesting. Just continuing, Mansour, did you?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to Sophia's comments. So from our perspective, we've seen that shift into Southeast Asia and South Asia. So for example, increases in over 20% of imports across those jurisdictions. And I think that sort of change in supply chain has had a big impact. But when I look at these sort of some of the corporate surveys we do, 80% still say they are looking at their supply chain. So I don't think that we have got anywhere near the movement that we would have anticipated post-Liberation Day or post-COVID, because it is still a big topic for a lot of our corporate customers.
Thanks for that, Mansour. Just continuing on, maybe more kind of at the product level, how would you say that working capital management has evolved over the last several years, and has any of that accelerated since April?
Yeah, so again, continuing on what's been said. So over the last 10 years, working capital management, be it payables, receivables, or inventory financing, has increased quite heavily. I mean, frankly, when we talk about inventory financing, we'll touch on this later on. There are a number of solutions that have been in the market over the last 10 years, but offer on-balance sheet inventory financing versus off-balance sheet inventory financing. So the change in dynamic, I suppose, is genuinely a change in accounting treatment. But from a corporate perspective, really we're seeing sort of two themes emerge. One is that there are large corporates in the market who have excess liquidity, who are actually reducing utilization of their programs more generally. They have cash, they can stockpile, and they're sort of really, they have support from their banking partners. And the second part of that is the corporates who are a little bit more stressed, who are seeking liquidity from funds beyond the sort of core bank partners. They're very much trying to sort of drive and build market share, but they are strained. And I think actually when we think about the solutions that are in the market today, a lot of the solutions and innovations we're seeing in the market are really to drive that sort of how do we protect ourselves as an industry while deploying and supporting growth in that corporate landscape. So again, just coming back to, from a transaction banking perspective, it's quite interesting because amalgamating the two sort of sides of that is how can I support the liquidity requirement for some of our corporate customers who require it, but also how can I support the ones who are just looking for efficiency but who have excess liquidity as we drive into their working capital metrics accordingly.
Yeah, so I think that leads us very nicely to Stuart as our inventory expert here. I think most of us who have been involved with inventory finance, we know it's complicated, but that there's a very significant value proposition. I had an interesting conversation yesterday where people talked about, will this ever be adopted in a pervasive way? And I said that actually, if you look back at supply chain finance 20 years ago, you would have had the same doubts. But here we are. So my question to you, Stuart, is inventory finance the final frontier of comprehensive working capital management? Do you feel it's gaining broader traction, and or what catalyst is needed in order for it to do so?
Well, I'll answer the last part of your question first, because clearly I do believe, otherwise I wouldn't have joined Procura. So I think a couple of things. Number one, let's not try to call it inventory finance. For our customers, it's not a finance, right? You are putting an intermediary in terms of an inventory management company like Procura between the bank and the customer. So for the customer standpoint, it's not financing. From the bank standpoint, yes, it's a financing to that intermediary like Procura. But it really is an inventory management solution for the underlying corporate. I think the second part is it really a working capital solution? Yes, working capital is a byproduct of creating the off-balance sheet treatment. But the driver for why companies do this, and the companies that have done this successfully, has got nothing to do with working capital. It is all about an underlying commercial imperative, right, as it relates to either a change in the strategic direction of their business, their industry, a change in the nature of their supplier relationships, a fragmentation of their logistics relationships and their inability to aggregate stock around the world and have a system of record conveniently for all of that stock. That's what drives an inventory management solution. Off the back of that, that creates an inventory finance solution. So yes, we are very, very grateful for our bank partners when they get us into the treasurer, but we recognize the treasurer is simply, how can we describe this, an ambassador of inventory management through the organization, not necessarily the decision maker. In fact, very rarely the decision maker. And it rarely has anything to do with working capital. If you get a junior treasury person that's just doing a theoretical exercise about how they can improve their KPIs on DIO, fine, we'll chat with them. But we generally know it's not going somewhere. When you sit down and somebody says, if I can do this, I will gain X in market share, my customers are demanding this, my suppliers can't do this, or I am chasing scarce inventory and I want to be able to hold it and have it way ahead of my competitors, that's what drives really meaningful conversation in inventory management. So I don't actually think of it as a working capital thing. I don't think of it as like supply chain finance or receivables, right? That's clearly a bank treasury discussion. Have at it. This is a very, very different discussion, and there has to be a commercial imperative. So what we look for from our banking partners is more, do you understand the client enough to know what the drivers are in their industry in terms of their relationships with their customers, their suppliers, and what's going on in that industry, and how does that customer sit?
Right. So in baseball terms, would you say we're in the first inning?
We're probably in, yeah, I think, listen, as Mansour said, inventory finance has been around a long time. You know, people used to call it repos. Then the accounting changed on repos, and then the commodity traders tried to think of different ways to do it. It's been around in commodity trade finance for a while. Borrowing-based facilities have been around. This is just simply a way to drive greater efficiency in the supply chains by giving people effectively higher advance rates, and really focusing in on commercial imperatives where not just a lack of working capital, a lack of capital is going to be there for companies to be able to support their strategic objectives.
Okay, good. I can't run the opening panel without talking about one of the elephants in the room, which is the First Brands and a couple of other high-profile bankruptcies that have happened in the working capital space during the course of this year. So I will open this to the trade bankers, but anybody who would like to answer.
I probably have a few opinions now, having spent 30 years in banks and seeing behaviors that lead to this. But now I can sit on the outside and poke holes.
Your response will still be welcome, regardless of what perspective you take. So my question is, there's lots of issues to unpack here and what happened with First Brands and a couple of others. Do we think that private credit will continue to make inroads into the trade finance space, or will there be a pause? Talk generally about the fallout of the episode and how it will change how either corporates or banks manage working capital and trade finance. The floor is open.
Okay, I'll give quickly my perspective on this. The answer is yes, it will continue. Now, obviously, we need to control it better because the immediate consequence and what we've seen in First Brand is really over-leverage and lack of disclosure that drives over-leverage, and that with private credit or not, these things we've seen them in before with Greensill or others. Every new player where you don't have disclosure, then you come up with over-leverage, and that kind of everything collapse from there. But I think there will be, anyway, new players in private credit or others. Even we've seen it recently on players even in the digital asset or the stablecoin world that are now funding trade finance or have appetite for it. For broadly two reasons from my perspective, and really this is a great conversation. One is the banks continue to have more and more regulation and constraint on the way we deploy capital. So we are more and more constrained in terms of how much we're going to put in the market and how much we can support. That's why the trade finance gap continue to widen, even if there is a lot of attention towards it. But that's driven by really more and more regulation and not less regulation on the bank. So that's one side of it. And the other side is there is a lot of, since COVID, probably a lot of liquidity from a lot of investors, from different type of investors that is looking for investment, for outlet for that. So it's like the water always finds a way down the stream. So we're looking at diversification and ways to put that money into work with diversification of risks that they take. And we've seen even stablecoin, as I was saying, players that are coming into building funds that are going to go into trade finance because they need some sort of weightage of the risk that they take in the investment. So yes, that will continue. The core topic really that we need to put on the table is the level of disclosure that needs to apply to everybody and the accounting rules on that. That what will protect, I guess, the investments and the reputation of what we so-called working capital. Even I don't think that was working capital. What happens in First Brand is just misuse as well of supply chain finance.
I'd echo the point around the fact that we're not seeing any change in appetite from private credit. I think there's a lot of opportunities in the market, and there is a push and significant amounts of liquidity in the market, as Sophia was saying, which is driving that investment into the trade and working capital space, frankly. And focusing on that private credit piece, I think the regulatory framework is so different between the bank space and the private credit space. At the end of the day, when we think about getting the liquidity to our underlying customers, if we can't provide it ourselves at a competitive price point or are holding significant amounts of capital to do that, actually having partners in the private credit space is very important.
Yeah. Well, Stuart?
I would just say with First Brands, it's a depressingly familiar tale. Seems to happen every 5 years or so in trade, right? There is clear warning signs, red flags, everything that was evident. But you have a client that is, an avaricious consumer of your trade product. It's an easy sell. The fees are good. The investment bankers like it. Don't challenge the customer. Don't piss them off. Right? It's a story as old as, certainly my career, which goes back to, probably 1860 something. But I think that lack of diligence and the fact that it's too easy, those are always the flags that people ignore because they're chasing the greed gets in the way, and they don't want to annoy their customer. And I find, for banks, a lot of times doing the hard work and delivering something of real value to a real customer is really, really hard. Doing something easy, which, where you can turn a little blind eye to some of the warning signs, yeah, I won't necessarily be around to bite the bullet if it happens. And people have gotten so used to, for the last 25 plus years, cheap money, liquidity, which hides pretty much all ills until it's gone. So First Brands to me is just, you can look at Abengoa, you can look at Hinling, you can look at Greensill. The highway of trade is littered with all of these kinds of names, and it's always the same pattern that plays out.
When it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true.
Yeah,
there is no such thing as a double-digit yield in trade finance. So.
Yeah. I think we could probably run a full session on this topic. For your humble moderator agrees. I think receivables finance has been around a lot longer than I have, and it will continue to be. And improved controls and disclosure and so forth are welcome, but the value proposition is a good one. And
yeah, if you don't do your diligence, if there's lots of bilateral lines, if there is opaqueness in terms of the source of financing, all of those warning signs are flashing. And again, anybody who has a private jet, that's always a warning sign. As soon as Greensill got the private jet, you knew it was.
That's the red flag.
Sorry.
I think the reality is, from a non-bank perspective, is now more than ever, the world is moving very fast. Business is happening really fast. There's so many different things that are impacting business. We're talking trade, whether it's tariffs, whether it's ESG, whether it's the pivot to data centers, or many other things in energy that are impacting. Nobody wants to get left behind. And sometimes speed could be compromised. But we could never compromise trust. And that's something that needs to be built into every single supply chain, with every single supplier, whether it's your financing arm, your technology arm, your operations, manufacturing, whatever it is. That's, your core should never be compromised as an organization. But we understand these things happen in the industry. But as Stuart mentioned, the constant compliance and auditing of these relationships and this ROI, because maybe these transactions 5 years is relatively low or very short term. But in the business that you're operating, most of the people involved understand the time horizons in the business that they operate in. And 5 years for some organization could be long term, whereas others could be very relatively short.
Thank you for that. Hannah, clearly a person of high integrity. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question on, I guess, sort of on the integrity side, on ESG. So in prior years, ESG had been a big topic here at this session, and I will say in the last year it's taken a back seat, at least in the media, but I know this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. So what are the latest developments in ESG and sustainability in the supply chain? And yeah, will this be front and center in future GTR sessions?
The latter part of the question, that's up to the GTR organization to answer. But as far as the industry is concerned, going back to we kind of referenced baseball earlier, what's really happening out there, I fundamentally believe, is the following. The hype, the buzz, the fireworks of organizations, greenwashing, some people call it that, I think for all that, it's actually settled now. What are you left with? Well, if you're in the World Series Game 7, right, the hype between Game 6 to Game 7 is at an all-time high. But there is a point where the national anthem isn't sung anymore, and it's time to play ball. And what you're left with are the actual players in the field. What does that actually mean for business? What it means is people who have ESG in their DNA and their core values, or organizations that have it, that actually believe in it, will continue down this path. And they will be the ones that are actually innovating and continuing the ESG journey. Any other organization that was part of the hype process, they're going to be left behind naturally, simply because they see no return on it. But for an organization that builds cases or use cases across their supply chains that can actually link it to an ROI, they won't be, compromising their core values because of somebody's decision, in a certain geography, irrespective of whether it's the U.S. or Europe or anywhere in the world, irrespective of political, geopolitical, understanding. Organizations who actually have it in core value will continue down this process. So, is it going to be a fundamental part of the next couple of years? Well, let's talk about different phases happened in the last 20 years. Has lean gone away? No. It still exists in every organization. Is it a front and center of every organization, of every conference? Not exactly. But people understand the value of it. And you continue to see every single element, like supply chain finance. Right? This is specifically a supply chain finance conference and trade. But you go to any other supply chain conference, it may not be the headline, but it's still part of the community. So in many ways, is it going away? Not exactly. People who believe in it will continue down that path.
Okay.
If I can just add maybe beyond the what you call the ethical part of it and why it's important. From a business perspective, there is no choice. All the technological advancement, everybody's talking about AI and new digital advancement that we have, that needs a lot of energy. And that energy is not going to come from traditional way of powering that. You need new energy supply. You need more energy supply. It will have to come from alternative source of energy, and those are more sustainable source of energy. Solar and the rest, that's going to be important. So there is, beyond the ethical, what's good to do for the environment and the climate, even if we've seen as well from that side a lot of acceleration from an adaptation finance perspective, so really climate and how do we adapt. So we see that a lot now. But just from a business perspective, there is a whole new economy coming up that needs a lot of energy supply, and there is no other choice than to develop that and support it and then finance it.
Well, I hope you're right, and GTR, I'm sure, will take note for future sessions. But let's switch gears to something that is front and center right now in the headlines and every conference that you go to. It's the main topic, which is AI. All the buzz. I'm going to open this to anyone who wants to comment. I think we have, those of us who have been in the industry a long time, we know that pervasive big digital solutions in the trade and working capital space have been problematic. We have a lot of legacy systems and fragmented processes, lots of people involved, and some antiquated processes that still involve paper in different places. So lots of challenges, but there's probably lots of opportunities too, maybe not big bang pervasive to start, but maybe more niche. So who here has seen good use cases in the AI space, either in terms of how corporates are using AI to better manage their supply chain, or banks in terms of delivering trade finance solutions?
So I can begin. So we think about AI from the following, right? And I think Stuart has a very practical approach when he talked about inventory financing and how that can be actually very practical, but not necessarily new. So artificial intelligence is not a novelty. Matter of fact, everybody in this room has used a facet of artificial intelligence. It's not a novelty because if you ever used a search engine like Google, that's artificial intelligence, right? If you ever traveled from one city to another, and if you ever traveled if you just traveled period to use an online map, right? That's artificial intelligence. Routing, mapping, weather, all of these things are artificial intelligence. We just haven't called it that over the years. 15, 20 years ago, if you were in an engineering space, this was called network engineering. Today, it's called artificial intelligence or agentic AI. If you ever built a Power BI dashboard and you made some type of informed decision around it, whether it's your ERP, WMS, or TMS, and somehow you built a data lake and you gave your business users some level of visibility on any type of dashboard, that's generative AI. So this is not a novel. This is not new, so to speak. But the reality is, when you look at all different types of supply chain, whether it's transportation and logistics, whether it's human capital, whether it's on the technical side where you start stacking applications or your different data management when it comes to it, or even more on the functional side, logistics, transportation, payables, how you're onboarding vendors, how you're paying vendors, your demand to deliver, your order to cash, irrespective of the level. There are many scenarios that are happening. Here recently, I actually published on LinkedIn about 50 use cases that are real, where supply chain organizations are actually doing, and many organizations out there are not necessarily doing all 50, but they are in the journey of applying some of these. And of course, the level of investment, the level of momentum you gain within your organization is dependent on what the actual return is, whether it's an efficiency, whether it's technology, or whether it's an actual financial ROI on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, large language models, absolutely. The ability to digest, consume huge amounts of data, and then give humans the ability to just decision based upon kind of the reporting of that. Absolutely, corporates are using. Banks are using, as it relates to documentary credit, as you guys face the inevitability of finding it very hard to get a Gen Z interested in checking documents all day. So, you have large language model and you have some of that basic predictive AI. In terms of really next generation AI, of consuming so many huge data points in terms of shipping data, weather data, all of that, geopolitics sensors, what's going on in terms of Arabic Facebook posts, is that going to be a predictor of something, right? That is still a way off, but I can see a day when that will come and that will allow people to be much more nimble. But the trouble is, every time you become more nimble, consumer expectation rises to that new level, right? And so you're always fighting that tide with consumer expectation. So in the end, the worst enemy, just like inventory keeps rising in the US because consumers want it in hours instead of days, instead of weeks, right? We are ourselves the one to blame because we get used to a certain level of comfort and then we demand the next level of comfort.
The only thing I would add to that is how fast can an organization develop AI is really dependent on the leadership and their mindset as far as what they're actually trying to accomplish. I'm fortunate to work for an organization at the moment where I had a one-to-one with our CEO. It understood that this is a race, if we call it that we want to participate in. And we are actively looking at many scenarios across the organization, whether it's from manufacturing, whether it's from distribution, or traditional sourcing of suppliers, so to speak, to identify where are these use cases and what do we need to do as an organization to prioritize what's the most important ones for us. And across the industry, organizations are taking this approach. I call it that we're all on the AI highway, we're just all at different speeds, but no one's on the side of the road. Everyone's still going, right? Just at different speeds.
I think the legacy infrastructure, that tech debt is huge, right? The inability to deploy new solutions and run them concurrently while still maintaining your old legacy systems, and the execution risk of that drives a lot of corporates to just, if they see their ROI get destroyed. Fortunately at Procura, we're, relatively new company. We put our technology on the blockchain. We can easily lay over stuff. We're able to add to it. But if I've got, 1980s Cobalt mainframes that I've also got to run in conjunction with everything
I'm old
else.
enough to remember that.
Yeah. then you've got a huge tech debt that you have to bite the bullet on, and that is a very painful, discussion when you're running every year, quarter by quarter.
In the interest of time, because I would like to, we have some questions coming in, I'd just like to ask one last question and very brief answers from everybody, and then we'll get to the questions. So, looking to the future, how will all this evolve if we want to look out maybe 3 to 5 years? How will working capital solutions evolve? Will we be closing the gap in the SME space that's often talked about? Will there be new forms of differentiation? Will trade and working capital be even more strategic to corporate clients? If you can answer each in maybe 15, 20 seconds, how will it be different a few years out? Start with Sophia.
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes, we're going to the right direction. I think the technology will help a lot. We will touch on it if we answer the third question, I think. One aspect that we haven't touched upon, and I think that's a really interesting question, but we talk about technology, it's not the problem. We talk about liquidity is not the problem, capital, we can find a way around that. What is really missing is today's same level of acceleration in terms of regulation and legislative agenda. When we talk about digitizing all this, it's really about the legal jurisdiction and the legal view on all these trade instruments that are still powering working capital. If we don't really change that, and it's not changing fast enough, we will not be very far from where we are today, because the technology is there. It's going to continue to evolve. Liquidity is there. Interest is there. Yes, now it's at the level of more strategic discussion, working capital optimization, resilience, predictability, yes, more important. But I think the missing agenda is the legislative one for the time being.
Hanai. Yeah.
So from an intellectual humility standpoint, I will continue these discussions with Sophia, Stuart, and Mansour, and trust their experience in the next couple of years as far as how this develops, and fully trust on their advice.
Generally, my predictions of the future have fallen flat, so take that with every grain of salt. But I do see working capital fragmenting, right? Historically, it's been, here's your payables solution, here's a receivables solution. There's a couple of different varieties within that. I think that will completely fragment, and it will fragment around the industries that are in high growth mode and who are doing things very differently. And there will be the more mature businesses which are not in high growth mode, where the traditional things will look very much the same as they do today. They will look the same 3-4 years. The industries, and I would say also certain markets, UAE, US, things will look, in certain industries, very, very different.
I suppose finally, from a Lloyd's perspective, so we've recently merged our cash and trade business, and actually one of the key reasons we did that is because as we look to the future, we think the delivery channel is through a single engagement with our customer across trade and working capital and cash management and payments. So we rolled in our ABL business, talking about inventory. We rolled in our asset finance business, our ECA business, under a single transaction banking umbrella, very much with the view that actually as we look to the forward and next stage of client engagement, we need to be talking cross-product and sort of solution-orientated with our customer base. And I think that's where we'll see growth within the underlying proposition, actually tying in the analytics, the AI, the automated credit decisioning into why we would do something in support of our customer.
Okay, some interesting perspectives there. So we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to try to cover some of the questions that are rolling in. It's hard for me to see from here and with my eyes and this microphone being here, but does it logically follow that successful utilization, perfect, thank you, of AI within the supply chain should ultimately lower inventory levels? I think we'll Stuart, a lightning round sort of answer from you would be great.
Probably not, because expectations will rise with it.
Well, that's a lightning round answer, okay. When banks are less and less willing to invest in developments with no return, how can digitization really be achieved? Is a good question, and probably why some of the consortiums out there have not taken off like the original expectations, but Mansour?
So just coming to this one, I mean, it's really interesting. We're seeing more and more investment into our business from the bank. And I think it's actually a material change that we've seen over the last 10 years, where actually the transaction bank, trade and working capital is seeing a much higher volume of investment versus other areas of the business. So I'd actually argue against that point.
Sophia, did you want to add, or?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the problem with this consortium was the lack of investment. Actually, there was a lot of investment. There was too much investment. It's really what the problem statement was not very clear, and what are we trying to solve for was not very clear, and that's why it continued. But
it's a technology looking for a problem.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'll take this one because that's what I was talking about earlier, which is MLTR adoption, the digitization of trade. And again, the problem is not really the technology, it's the legislation around it. So when we take the example of, will it drive SCF to electronic promissory note, I suppose? So, if I take the example of something similar, which is what we call DigiPo, digital purchase order, that powers deep tier supplier finance as a proposition. That's fully technology, it's programmable, it's fragmented purchase orders that you can finance and helps you go deeper into the supply chain finance world. The only part of the world that is adopted and successful is China, because it has dedicated law around it that wraps it and gives it the protection of ownership. If we don't solve for that, which is the legislation around actual e-bill of ladings and things like that, which is who owns it, is it recognized in court? The technology is not the problem. We need to solve for that, and then the adoption will be fast.
Thank you. Stuart, I think this next one was intended for you in terms of how
Maybe
can
my
you and
parents should
other
have called me Scott. That would have been
companies
easier.
help us navigate the regulations and so forth. Keep it broad.
Yeah, listen, we're not interested in helping companies avoid OFAC naughty lists. That's I like my freedom. I like like not being in jail. some of the things I'm grateful for in the morning. So yeah, zero interest in helping somebody avoid an OFAC list.
Okay, and I think let's wrap up with the last question. Hanai, maybe you take this one. Are we going to be increasingly automated, and what are we going to do with all the people in the workforce?
Yeah, so this is a very important question, probably one of the most fascinating ones of belief system I have, which is people. Right? So all of this technology, whether it's AI robotics, whether it's Gen AI, agentic AI, or whatever facet of artificial intelligence is out there, I don't necessarily believe that these things are actually replacing people. I think people who use AI will replace people. Right? Like at some point, I mentioned lead management and project management and many other skill sets that exist today in professionals. I think those people will be at the forefront. And I also believe, I have a lot of hope that even in the education system, even today in the US, you will see a lot more interest towards artificial intelligence and programs being built around that. But it is up to the organizations to take a particular interest in their workforce, not just for the next generation, but for the current generation of workers that are actively employed. I think it's a responsible thing, but I think it's also an energizing thing that corporations look at that.
So I won't have to be supporting my kids forever.
John, do you want me to just take the last one very, very quickly? Super quickly, right? Again, this is about First Brands and whether the use of appointing First Brands the collection agent for receiving the cash and making the payables. again, it's a simple view. You look at the totality of the risk. Any one mitigant you can put in there may or may not change the totality of the risk. You could say, listen, as a bank, I want cash dominion. You're going to pay into my account. That's one mitigant. But if you look at the totality of the risk, the lack of transparency in terms of all of these bilateral lines, so you couldn't look through to see the totality of what they were doing, right? You have a ton of decision points when you're dealing with a corporate, and you have a ton of potential mitigants. Whether you have the will to stand your ground and say, these are the mitigants I insist on, otherwise there's no deal, that's up to the bank. But any one of those things in isolation is not the cause of why there was a failure.